If you're looking for a group that really wants to cut at the heart of the problem in Washington, or for that matter, across your state capitals, try Coalition to Reduce Spending. You can find more about them at www.reducespending.org. That's reducespending.org. Jonathan Bydlak is the president of that great little group, and he joins us once again. So now we're moving from the discretionary spending defeat, as it were, can you imagine anybody agreeing to raise spending in the near term on the promise to cut spending in the 7th, 8th, and 9th year? I mean, seriously.
Well, I can imagine it pretty well because that's what's happened, and that's what's, of course, been the story of spending attempts to reduce spending in the past. And this is nothing new. This is kind of what always happens: is let's increase spending now, but don't worry, we'll make those cuts down the road.
Well, as soon as that 10-year Treasury rate, as soon as the tapering actually takes hold and the markets believe rates are headed north, we're going to have a judgment day here, because when the government has to finance its debt at market rates, it's not going to be sustainable unless we have drastic spending cuts. And I just don't know that this current crop of politicians has the stomach for that. There are a couple out there. Rand Paul's one of them. I don't know of too many others that might lead the way, but I'm not optimistic.
Well, this is why I think there needs to be a new way of thinking about spending. Sort of the debate that we always have is, do we cut this program? Do we not cut this program? And the way that we like to talk about it is in terms of offsets. I think that if people started to realize that when you want to spend on a given program, there's a trade-off to that, we'd be in a much better position. And so, when you see these debates, like, for example, unemployment benefits, right, that we just had last week, one of the things that I think would be fantastic is if we could get people to say, all right, if we're going to spend on that program, then we should be cutting something somewhere else. Now, I'll admit that, that's not the kind of cuts that I ultimately think need to happen to sort of improve our economic well-being. But that's the kind of thinking that we need to start having on both sides of the aisle.
Well, the Democrats say they're the pay-as-you-go party.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. And I think it's something, the example I always like to talk about was when last year, when there was sort of the bill to provide extra benefits to victims of Superstorm Sandy, Congressman Mick Mulvaney from South Carolina offered an amendment that said, all right, if we're going to provide these, $60-70 billion in extra benefits, let's make cuts to the discretionary budget. Now, that amendment failed, but 5 Democrats voted for it. And so the reason it ultimately failed was because not enough Republicans, of course Republicans control the House, not enough Republicans were actually in favor of the idea of thinking of spending in terms of trade-offs. And I think the fact that you had 5 Democrats who supported that amendment, even without any sort of lobbying by anyone, shows you that that there is a market out there for thinking about spending in terms of trade-offs. And my view is that if we're going to ultimately move forward, that's the way that we're going to have to force elected officials to think about our problem.
I'm glad you mentioned Mick. He's a friend of mine, and he is a true blue guy, and he believes in spending cuts across the board. There are no sacred cows. I think that's the other paradigm shift we need. That the history has been, well, I want to cut your program, but I want my ethanol program. I'm Charles Grassley of Iowa. I want to keep that going in my wind farms. I want to keep those going too because it's good for my state. But I'll cut your programs. And then, of course, Chuck Schumer says I'll cut ethanol, but I want massive food stamp programs in the city of New York. Whatever the case might be. Instead, why doesn't somebody come along and say we ought to cut them all? And then if you back off and you say, look, Mr. Schumer, I'm cutting the Pentagon. I'm cutting farm subsidies. I'm doing my job. Now, why don't you take your programs and cut yours? Aren't you in a stronger position then?
Absolutely. And, the idea that all spending should be on the table is one that should really be taken seriously by both parties. And, of course, as we said earlier, the norm, however, hasn't been to think of spending in that way. And I think from a political standpoint, Republicans tend to talk a better game than Democrats on the spending issue. But the reality when you look at actions is that they often are not much better, or, it's only sort of a small cadre that has ended up, being better. And so, at the end of the day, that's what you need to start seeing. You need to get both sides to agree that all of their sacred cows are open to the chopping block.
And as you say, the unemployment benefits debate, I think it was, $6.4 billion to extend these once again. First it was 3 months, then it was through November,
right.
Give an inch, as they say. And that was pure deficit financing, which is a bastardization of the UI program. The UI program for 26 weeks was to be the pay-as-you-go program funded by employers, which I don't think is the best way to fund it. But regardless, funded by employers at the state level for 26 weeks, pay-as-you-go. Every dollar we're added to federal extension benefits is a deficit finance dollar.
Well, and as you know, Jason, that program is a very recent one. It was created as a temporary program in the economic crisis in 2008 to provide benefits on top of benefits that are provided by the states. But of course,
but the state's exhausted. They're broke.
There's nothing so permanent like a temporary government program. And so that's what we're seeing right now with respect to unemployment insurance.
Where is that headed in D.C.?
Unemployment insurance?
Yeah,
I think
with the unemployment debate. Yeah.
I think one of the questions is whether or not it it ends up being offset. I mean, one of the things that was encouraging, there were 6 Republicans who broke and sided with the Democrats in this debate last week. But the reasoning provided by the Republicans in opposition was that they thought that unemployment insurance should be offset. So if there is kind of a glimmer of hope in this debate, it's that perhaps if this ends up being enacted, we will end up seeing an offset elsewhere in the budget. And I'm somewhat optimistic in the sense that, from a strict dollars and cents standpoint, unemployment benefits aren't, it's not the same as, the cost of, say, Medicare. And so it should be actually much easier to offset that spending.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can't find $6.5 billion in a $3.5 trillion budget?
Exactly.
I mean,
exactly.
Come on, guys. Ray LaHood's at it again, the former transportation secretary, saying, oh, no, we need to raise the gas tax by 10 cents a gallon. He didn't say 10 cents a gallon, but testimony by the CBO last summer said if you want this thing to be solvent, the Highway Trust Fund, and you're not willing to reduce the mass transit nonsense, the mass transit account, the bike trails, and all the rest, you're going to have to raise the gas tax by 10 cents a gallon. So now we're going from 18 to over 28 cents a gallon. That ought to be something a fragile economy could use.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big problems though is that oftentimes it's easier to focus on the tax debate than it is on the spending side because it's everyone kind of has their own little program that they want to see, and so instead we say, well, that's okay, we'll deficit spend and we'll end up going and tinkering with taxation, and and the both sides are sort of they all kind of have their own little taxes that they want to tinker with, and so it's. This is the state of things in Washington, unfortunately.
Why do we? I mean, so Ike creates the federal interstate system in the 1950s, as coming out of the DoD. By the way, it was a defense project.
Right.
It's been built for a while. We've got the infrastructure to flee those nuclear bombs, which probably won't be dropped anytime soon. Why does this have to be a federal program? Why not say, all right, here's what we're going to do to the state, to the federal taxpayer. We're going to repeal the federal gas tax. No more 18 cents on gasoline, no more 24 cents on diesel. But your state is going to be responsible for upgrading the interstates, for widening the lanes. They're competent people at some level anyway, so they can make certain the roads meet at the border. It shouldn't be real hard. So if they want to raise the state gas tax back up 18 cents, some may, but some might get the same job done for 10 cents a gallon.
Yeah, and I think what you're really hitting on here is that the sort of the litmus test that I think all of your listeners should be thinking about when you think about any government program is simply what are we spending and what are we getting for it, and that's of course a question that's kind of it's kind of a banned in, I guess, Washington D.C. or inside the Beltway. But that's fundamentally what we're asking, and so that's true with a lot of these programs, right? It's true with if you analyze programs in any department in Washington, you're going to find that oftentimes the majority of the time the costs are not justified by the supposed benefits, and in fact those benefits can be better provided in the private sector if consumers really demand them.
No question about it. And we need congestion pricing. Reason Foundation's done a good job on that. We need some, to trim around the edges. But how ironic is it that the subsidies for electric cars, for hybrids, the CAFE standards, which actually end up killing people on our highways because of lighter cars, have now resulted in a government shortfall of revenue because people are paying or using less gas. I mean, talk about poetic justice.
Well, Well, the tough thing is, of course, you can never repeal economic laws, and people again respond to incentives, and the ultimate incentive is our prices, and so I think that's exactly what you're describing right here.
Speaking of repealing the laws of economics, let's come back and talk about the Affordable Care Act. We've got this report out now that, surprise, surprise, Jonathan, people who are enrolling are skewing older and sicker. Boy, I didn't see that one coming. Jonathan Bydlak, president of Coalition to Reduce Spending, will come back up and wrap it up.